Amy always felt Heartland's spirit was unbreakable, a constant through all of life's storms. But lately, a hush had fallen over the ranch, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like absence. The vibrant tapestry of laughter, love, and shared moments seemed faded, a whisper of what it once was. With Ty gone, a persistent question haunted Amy. Could she ever truly feel complete again? Then, after so much time had passed, a figure from her past reappears, pulling Amy back into a vortex of memories and emotions she had fought hard to keep submerged. Can she confront the unspoken truths that linger between them? And more critically, can she release the hold of the one person to whom she never had a chance to say a proper goodbye? The sun dipped below the horizon, painting Heartland in hues of orange and purple, yet the beauty of the scene felt tinged with a deep solitude. Amy stood by the old oak tree at the edge of the paddock, her fingers tracing the rough bark, a familiar comfort. Every inch of Heartland, every rustle of leaves, every distant nicker of a horse, resonated with memories of time. Her chest ached as the last sliver of sun vanished, mirroring the countless days that had slipped away without him. Years had passed since Ty's departure, yet the rawness of it felt like only yesterday. The life they had envisioned, the dreams they had woven together, remained vivid in her mind. The world outside Heartland had spun on, the seasons had changed, and Amy herself had changed. Yet she could still hear Ty's voice in the sigh of the wind and sense his reassuring presence in the steadfast gaze of the horses they had healed together. Their time together had been a whirlwind of joy, heartache, and a profound love that had fundamentally shaped her. But life, indifferent to readiness, marches on. As much as Amy cherished Ty's memory, a truth she couldn't ignore gnawed at her. She was anchored to the past. It was a truth she resisted, but the persistent ache in her soul was undeniable. The ranch was different without him, and so was she. Amy took a deep breath, trying to dispel the melancholic thoughts that had become her constant companion. She had to endure, for the sake of the ranch, her family, her own spirit. Yet, despite her resolve, a fragment of her remained suspended in time, clinging to a past that was irretrievably gone. Just as she turned towards the house, the crunch of gravel announced an arrival. Her heart, it was a sound tied to a different era, yet instantly recognizable. Someone was approaching, someone from a chapter of her life she thought was closed. She knew, even before seeing, who it was. A wave of mingled anticipation and dread washed over her. Caleb. Her mind spun. Why Caleb? After all these years, after the silence and the distance, why would Caleb show up now? Amy stood rooted to the spot, her breath caught in her throat. The weight of unspoken words and unresolved history hung heavy in the air between where she stood and the approaching vehicle. Before she could steel herself, Caleb emerged from his truck, moving towards her with a hesitant gait. He looked older, lines of worry etched around his eyes, but the familiar earnest expression was still there. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, reminiscent of an approaching thunderstorm. Amy held her breath, unsure what to say, or if she even wanted to hear what he had come to share. The past was a labyrinth, and she was wary of re-entering its confusing paths. Yet, there he was, before her, as if no time had passed. For a long moment, only the whisper of the evening breeze filled the silence. Caleb just stood there, his hands clasped loosely, his gaze fixed on Amy, as if waiting for her to bridge the chasm of years. Then, her voice barely more than a whisper, Amy asked the question that echoed the turmoil in her heart. Caleb, what brings you here? The words were a blend of surprise and cautious apprehension. The years had forged resilience in her, but she wasn't sure she was prepared to unearth the past she had so carefully laid to rest. Somehow, though, she sensed this confrontation was inevitable. Caleb's sudden appearance felt like a stone dropped into the still waters of her life. The quiet of the ranch felt amplified, each second stretching, heavy with the unspoken history between them. Amy remained still, her eyes locked on Caleb, who stood a few paces away. His presence, after such a long absence, stirred a complex mix of emotions deep within her, emotions she wasn't certain she was ready to confront. The ranch had never felt so profoundly silent. Caleb hesitated, then took a tentative step close, his eyes reflecting a deep weariness and a touch of regret, met hers. Amy's heart pounded, but she didn't move, couldn't move. It wasn't just the shock of seeing him again. It was what he represented, a piece of her history, a history she had tried to outrun. Yet, there he was, as if the intervening years were but a fleeting moment. Caleb opened his mouth, then paused, the words seemingly caught between then and now. "Amy," he began, his voice huskier than she remembered, almost hesitant. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I had to see." His words felt heavy, pulling her towards a past she'd fought to keep at bay. Amy instinctively recoiled slightly, her gaze questioning. "See me?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "You just appear out of the blue after all this time, and you needed to see me." Caleb looked down, a flicker of discomfort crossing his features. He was clearly wrestling with something unspoken. Amy felt the familiar tension rise, an invisible barrier between them. She craved answers, needed them, but the thought of reopening old wounds made her heart clench. Yet, a part of her recognized that this moment, however unwelcome, was here, and there was no avoiding it. "I know this is unexpected," Caleb continued, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "But there's something I need to tell you, Amy. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Something about Ty." Amy's breath hitched. Ty. The name alone sent ripples through her. Her mind raced. Why now? What could Caleb possibly say about Ty that could alter anything after so much time had passed? Her fingers tightened, seeking the reassurance of the rough bark of the oak tree, as if it could steady her against the storm brewing within. "You've been gone, Caleb," Amy said, her voice quiet, edged with a hurt she thought had dulled. "You both just vanished." "I know, Amy. I know," Caleb said, his voice earnest, almost pleading. "And I can't change how I handled things back then. I made mistakes. Huge ones. I've lived with that. But this isn't just about me. This is about Ty. And something he wanted you to know. Something he couldn't tell you himself." The weight of his words was immense, and Amy felt a knot tighten in her stomach. There was more to this than a simple apology, or a friendly visit. She could feel it. His eyes held a strange mix of sorrow and urgency, and she knew this wasn't just about him clearing his conscience. There was something bigger at play, and despite her fear of what he might reveal, an undeniable current of curiosity pulled at her. She straightened, her arms crossing protectively, her stance a mixture of defense and reluctant openness. "What is it you think I need to know, Caleb?" she asked, her voice steadier now, but laden with the years of unresolved questions. "After everything, why come to me with this now? What could possibly change?" Caleb took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of nervousness she remembered. "Look, Amy, there's no easy way to say this. Ty, before he left, he was involved in something he thought was for the best, to protect you, to protect Heartland. But it was complicated, and it went." The mention of Ty protecting her, of complications, sent a chill down Amy's spine. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Ty, her Ty. What could Caleb possibly mean? And why was he the one telling her this? And not Ty himself if he were able? "Ty," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. Caleb nodded, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I know this is a shock. He made me promise not to say anything, unless it was clear he wasn't coming back. And it's been clear for a long time now, hasn't it?" Amy's breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to scream that Ty would return, but the hope had dwindled to a faint ember over the years. The possibility of understanding, of finally knowing the why, was suddenly before her, offered by the most unexpected person. Her heart ached with a renewed intensity. The years of wondering, of piecing together fragments, suddenly felt overwhelming. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. Caleb's expression softened with a deep, painful understanding. "He couldn't. Amy, the situation, it was dangerous. He thought silence was the only way to keep you safe. He wrote something though. A letter. He asked me to give it to you if he didn't make it back within a certain time." Amy swallowed hard, a flood of emotions she had suppressed for so long surging to the surface. "A letter," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the rustling leaves. Caleb took another step closer, his presence now both a comfort and a source of intense anxiety. "Amy, Ty left you this letter, and I think it might give you the answers you've been searching for, the peace you deserve." The air seemed to crackle with unspoken words as Amy's heart pounded. The truth, she had yearned for it, dreamed of it, despaired of ever finding it. And now, Caleb, a ghost from her past, was offering her a piece of it, a key to understanding. But what would that understanding cost? Was she truly prepared to read what Ty had written, to face the reality of his choices, his reasons? "I love you, more than words can say. Forgive me." Amy's vision blurred as the words in Ty's unmistakable handwriting swam before her eyes. She had imagined his final words to her countless times, but these few stark sentences felt both like a balm and a fresh wound. It wasn't the detailed explanation she had craved, not the long, heartfelt goodbye she had needed, just a handful of words, so potent, so final. But then, as her gaze dropped, she saw it was more than just a folded note. Tucked inside was a faded photograph, one she hadn't seen in years. A candid shot of her and Ty laughing, taken during a trail ride in the early days. The mountains majestic behind them, a shared dream in their eyes. Caleb's voice was soft. "He carried that with him, Amy. Always. He wanted you to have the letter. And this, he said you'd understand the significance of the place in the photo, that you'd find your answers there, not just in his words." Amy's mind reeled. The photograph, the specific trail, the lookout point it depicted, a place they had discovered together, a place they had called their own sanctuary, where they'd shared hopes and fears. What was Ty trying to lead her to? Her hands shook as she held the letter and the photograph. The words "forgive me" echoed in her mind, now imbued with a deeper, more painful meaning. And the photograph, it wasn't just a memory, it felt like a map. "What does this mean, Caleb?" she asked, her voice a mere breath. "I think," he said gently, "Ty wanted you to go there. He believed you'd find what you needed to truly understand, to perhaps even heal." Amy stared at the photograph, her mind racing with a whirlwind of confusion, sorrow, and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. A fragile, tentative hope. She had spent so long trying to navigate the landscape of her grief, trying to find a path through the pain of his absence. Now this letter, this photograph, felt like a compass, pointing her towards a destination unknown. Would she find the closure she so desperately sought, or would it only unearth more pain? Regardless, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, this wasn't an end. It was a new, daunting beginning. And a part of her, the part that had never stopped loving Ty, was ready to follow where he led. The evening air grew cooler, the shadows lengthening, as Amy stood there, the photograph in one hand, the letter in the other, her world tilted on its axis. The familiar comfort of Heartland seemed to recede, replaced by an unnerving sense of the unknown. Clarity, once her steadfast companion on this land, had dissolved. Everything had changed, yet nothing felt resolved. The photograph, Ty's final poignant gesture, had unlocked a chamber in her heart she thought was sealed forever. It was as if she'd been standing on the precipice of a vast canyon for years, paralyzed by the drop, But now this tangible link to him, this instruction, made the ground beneath her feel solid enough to take a step. The path it indicated was shrouded in mist, a journey that felt both like a summons and a profound risk. Ty had loved her. That was undeniable. But could she reconcile that love with the choices he'd made, the silence he'd left behind? Could she open her heart again to the man who had vanished, leaving her adrift in a sea of unanswered questions? She hadn't realized how tenaciously she'd clung to the wreckage of their past, until this very moment, when everything she believed about love, loss, and resilience was being fundamentally challenged. How does one move forward from a love that still felt so alive? How could she accept that the future they'd planned might remain an unfinished dream? Amy sank onto the porch swing, its familiar creak a counterpoint to the turmoil inside her. Her fingers tightened around the photograph, as if it were a lifeline. The letter lay open in her lap, its few words a constant refrain. "Forgive me." The plea echoed in her mind, louder now, as if Ty himself were there, urging her to understand the weight of his actions, the love that had driven him even into silence. But the truth was, she wasn't sure she could bear that weight alone. The intervening years had been a relentless teacher. She had learned to function without him, to draw strength from the rhythm of the ranch, from the quiet companionship of the animal. She had poured her energy into Heartland, into the demanding work that kept her mind occupied and her heart guarded. But now, with Caleb's revelation, with Ty's photograph and his plea for forgiveness, the carefully constructed walls around her heart were beginning to show cracks. The idea of a message, of something tangible left by Ty, was both a solace and an immense burden. What if the journey to that place in the photograph led her to a truth too painful to bear? What if it led her back to a part of herself she had painstakingly moved beyond? She didn't know if she was ready to revisit that vulnerability, especially when her heart felt so exposed. As her gaze swept across the familiar landscape of the ranch, Amy contemplated everything she had managed to sustain since Ty's departure. She had kept Heartland alive. She had fought for her family, for the horses, for the land itself. But in doing so, she had also been fighting herself, fighting the grief, the incessant longing that crept in during the quiet hours, when the loneliness was a palpable presence. She had convinced herself she could be okay without him, that she could rebuild, live a life independent of the anchor he had always been. But now, at this unexpected crossroads, the truth was inescapable. Could she truly let him go? Could she accept a future that didn't include him? A future shaped by his absence? The questions were overwhelming, pressing in on her, each demanding an answer she didn't possess. She loved him. She always would. But was love enough to bridge the chasm his choices had created? Was love enough to heal the wounds of his silence? In that moment, a profound sense of vulnerability enveloped her. It felt as though every defense she had erected had been stripped away, leaving her raw, exposed, and profoundly uncertain. It was terrifying, but as much as she resisted it, she knew this was a moment of reckoning, the moment she could no longer evade the truth of her own heart. With a deep, steadying breath, Amy rose. The photograph felt significant in her hand, its weight both a burden and a strange comfort. She wasn't ready for whatever lay ahead, but the choice was no longer hers to delay. She had to take that first step towards the place he'd indicated. She had spent so long trying to decipher the past, trying to make sense of the inexplicable, trying to keep alive the faint hope that one day Ty might walk back into her life. But the truth was, she had to start living for the present, for herself. She couldn't remain suspended, waiting for a future that might never materialize. The wind stirred again, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As she looked out towards the distant mountains, her heart was heavy with the weight of the journey ahead. She didn't know what the photograph truly signified, or if the place it depicted held the peace she craved. But she knew this. She couldn't keep her life on hold for time. She had to find a way to move forward, even if it meant finally truly saying goodbye to the dream of them, the dream of a life they had once so vividly imagined. With one last lingering look at the ranch, her sanctuary, her home, Amy stepped towards the unknown, her heart aching, yet stirring with a nascent resolve to find her own way, to build a future that honored the past but was not imprisoned by it. The love she held for Ty would forever be a part of her, a guiding star, but she was ready to honor him and herself by seeking the truth whatever it might be. It was the hardest decision she had ever faced, but it was the only path towards genuine healing. Emotional echoes, Ty's intention. The ranch grew quieter as twilight deepened. The chirping of crickets was the only sound that punctuated the charged silence. Caleb's words, Ty's letter, the photograph, they hung in the air like an unfinished melody. But Amy couldn't escape the unsettling feeling that there was more to this than she understood. Her mind was a whirlwind, thoughts colliding as the reality of Ty's message, delivered so many years later, struck her with unexpected force. It had been an eternity, yet the memories of him remained sharp, vivid, branded onto her soul, as if summoned. Her mind drifted back to moments she thought were buried deep. The sound of Ty's laughter, warm and uninhibited, echoed in her memory, a sound that had once been the soundtrack to her happiness. They had built a world together, and even in their most trying times, they had always found their way back to each other, until the day he did. Amy's expression softened as she turned from Caleb, her gaze lost in the middle distance, seeing scenes from their past play out. The barn, the rolling pastures, the familiar trails, everything was a testament to him. It was as if she could still feel his presence beside her, his steady hand on a nervous colt, his quiet confidence by the fence line as they discussed their dreams. But that future had been stolen, leaving her to gather the shattered pieces alone. A vivid memory surfaced, their first serious argument, followed by the tearful reconciliation in the old tack room, the scent of leather and hay surrounding them. "I'm not perfect, Amy," Ty had said, his voice raw with emotion, "but I'm yours." She could almost feel the sincerity of those words again. Ty's promises hadn't been mere platitudes. They had been her foundation in a world that often felt precarious. He had been her constant, her unwavering support. Even when everything else crumbled, he was her shelter, her strength. But now, facing Caleb, that sense of security felt like a fragile relic. Ty's absence had carved a void that nothing, not even the enduring spirit of Heartland, could entirely fill. Amy had strived to move on, to make peace with his unexplained departure, but she had never truly released him. Her thoughts shifted again, to the last morning she saw him, the morning he rode out and never rode back. She remembered standing on the porch, a knot of unease in her stomach as she watched him disappear over the rise. "I'll see you tonight," he'd called back, a smile in his voice. But tonight never came in the way she expected. A part of her had known, even then, that something was shifting, something irrevocable. The moment she realized he wasn't coming back as promised, a piece of her had fractured. And now, all these years later, standing with Caleb, she was trapped between that devastating past and an uncertain present. As she stood there, her hand resting on the porch railing, Amy closed her eyes, battling the surge of emotions that threatened to engulf her. "I tried to stop waiting," she whispered, more to herself than to Caleb. But the truth was, a part of her had always been waiting. Caleb's voice, softer now, intruded on her reverie. "I know this is painful, Amy, but Ty, he truly believed he was doing what was necessary. He never stopped loving you." Amy's eyes flew open, her heart constricting. Her mind had been on overdrive, trying to reconcile the Ty she knew with the man who could leave without a word. And now, hearing Caleb's assertion, something within her, a tightly wound spring of grief and confusion, began to unwind. Ty had loved her. He had left a message, But was it enough to bridge the silence of years? Was it enough to quiet the relentless question? The questions seared Amy's mind, each one more unanswerable than the last. Caleb continued, his voice low and filled with a sorrow that mirrored her own. Ty, he couldn't face saying goodbye. Amy, not when he didn't know if it was truly goodbye. He didn't want to leave you in limbo. But he saw no other way out of the situation he was in, and he needed you to eventually know this. A lump formed in Amy's throat. She wanted to rage, to rail against the unfairness of it all, to shout at Caleb for dredging up this pain, but all she could do was stand there, paralyzed by the sheer force of his words and the implications of the letter and photograph she held. What are you saying, Caleb? She asked, her voice barely a tremor. What exactly did Ty want me to find? Caleb hesitated, his expression grave as if measuring the impact of his next statement. He wrote that he made a difficult choice, one that cost him everything. He believed that by going to that place in the photograph, you'd find the final piece of the puzzle, the full story, something that would explain why he couldn't come back. Amy's pulse throbbed in her temples. Could it be? Could there truly be a tangible explanation? A reason that might finally allow her to understand? Had he known that even after all this time, she was still adrift, searching for an anchor of truth? Where is this place? Amy's voice was faint, but the urgency was undeniable. Caleb's eyes held a deep sadness. The letter doesn't say where, just that the photo is the key. He trusted you'd remember. He said it was a place only you two truly knew. Amy's heart clenched. The truth, the word was a double-edged sword, offering the promise of light but also the threat of deeper shadow. She had lived for so long with the phantom of Ty, trying to reconstruct their love from fading memories. But now the truth, the one thing he had withheld, seemed almost within reach. Amy closed her eyes briefly, gathering her strength. She wasn't ready to confront the emotions she had buried so deeply, but a stronger, deeper part of her knew she had no alternative. This was the moment she had unknowingly been moving towards. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to find peace. Okay, she said, her voice surprisingly firm despite the internal earthquake. I need to see this through. Caleb nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes, mixed with a profound understanding. As he stepped back, giving her space, Amy knew this was the precipice of a new, terrifying journey. But whether it led to closure or to a fresh wave of sorrow, she had to take it. The silence that fell was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of Ty's last message, with the promise of a journey. Amy's heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs, as she looked again at the photograph Caleb had given her, the one Ty had kept. It was old, the colors faded, the edges softened from handling. There was nothing written on the back, no clues, just the image of them, younger, carefree, against a backdrop of mountains she knew so well. Her breath hitched as she stared at it, her mind racing to place the exact spot. Caleb didn't rush her. He stood quietly, his gaze conveying a deep empathy. I know this is a lot to take in, he said gently, his voice filled with the sorrow of the years he'd carried this secret. But I believe it's what Ty would have wanted for you to know. Amy's hand trembled as she traced the outline of the mountains in the photograph. Was this truly what he had intended? A cryptic message? A journey to an unnamed place? Or was it another painful reminder of all she had lost? Of the future that had been stolen from them? Caleb watched her, his own eyes clouded with regret. You need to understand, Amy, he continued, his voice hoarse with emotion. Ty wasn't trying to be cruel by leaving you in the dark. He was trying to protect you from something far worse than his absence. There's a story there, in that place, that he needed you to find for yourself. The world seemed to tilt as she looked from the photograph to Caleb. She felt like she was on the edge of a vast unknown, a chasm that separated her past from any possible future. So many questions
Questions she had suppressed for years now clawed their way to the surface. Why that specific place? What secret did it hold? And why had Ty entrusted this final heartbreaking task to Caleb? Of all people, Ty always said you were the strongest person he knew, Amy. Caleb added, his voice barely above a whisper. He believed that if anyone could understand, could find the truth and make peace with it, it was you. Amy's throat constricted. His words were a strange mix of comfort and an almost unbearable burden. She had always known Ty's reasons for leaving must have been profound, but hearing Caleb articulate Ty's faith in her, his belief in her strength, made the memories of their shared life, their unwavering bond, feel both incredibly precious and agonizingly distant. Was that why he'd left this cryptic trail? Because he trusted her to follow it, to uncover the truth he couldn't voice. Amy slowly refolded the letter and tucked it with the photograph into her pocket. The weight of them felt immense, a tangible link to their love, their struggles, their unresolved ending, the longing that had been her constant companion for so long. The unanswered questions all seemed to coalesce around these two small items. For a moment she stood motionless, trying to summon the courage to embark on this journey. The thought of finally understanding, of piecing together the fragments of Ty's story was almost overwhelming. She was terrified of what she might discover, terrified that the truth might be more devastating than the silence she had endured. Caleb seemed to read her mind. You don't have to go today, he said softly, but I think you deserve to find what he wanted you to find, what he couldn't show you himself. Amy felt the last rays of the setting sun on her skin as she stood in the twilight, surrounded by the ghosts of the life she had known. It felt as though the entire world held its breath, waiting for her decision. Would she seek out this place? Would she finally confront the truth that had shaped so much of her life? Slowly, deliberately, Amy nodded. As she did, she felt a shift within her, a subtle realignment of her spirit. It wasn't the letter itself, but the journey it promised. The photograph's silent invitation. Ty hadn't just left words. He had left a path. Her fingers tightened around the photograph in her pocket, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange resurgent determination. On the faded paper, the image of them, young and full of hope, seemed to call to her.